The courtroom froze. No one had ever spoken to a Supreme Court justice like this. For a moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath. The gavel struck once, sharp and metallic, but the echo only deepened the silence. Eyes darted from bench to gallery, from reporters' pens hovering above notepads to cameras capturing every flicker of expression. And at the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, her voice still reverberating in the heavy air. She had not shouted. She had not raised her hands. Yet the weight of her words cut deeper than any scream could. The murmurs began in ripples first. A gasp from the gallery, then the whispered disbelief of clerks who had spent years in this chamber, convinced they had seen it all. But they had never seen this. They had never seen a woman, young and unflinching, look directly into the eyes of Justice Barrett and refuse to shrink. Respect, Crockett said, steady as stone, isn't a one-way street. If you demand it from us, you must be willing. To show it in return, gasps turned into scattered nods. A reporter's pen snapped in his fingers, breaking under the pressure of his grip. Even the marble pillars seemed to lean in closer, as though eager witnesses to history. Across the bench, Justice Barrett's lips tightened. She did not answer. She adjusted her robe, tried to steady her gaze, but the damage was done. The courtroom could feel it. The unthinkable had happened. A line had been crossed, not with disrespect, but with courage that demanded to be recognized. Was this arrogance, as critics would soon cry? Or was this the courage America needed, the voice of a generation refusing to bow in the presence of power? The audience inside the chamber didn't agree, but they all felt ear-tan electricity no one could deny. Because, in a place built on tradition, on silence, on carefully measured words, Jasmine Crockett had broken the script. She had rewritten the rules in front of the nation. And in that moment, every immigrant daughter, every overlooked voice, every silenced protester watching from afar felt that maybe, just maybe, they had spoken to. This wasn't just an exchange. What happened in that hushed chamber would rewrite the rules of courtroom power. To grasp its weight, you have to understand what this room represented. The Supreme Court is not merely wood and marble, not merely robes and gavels. It is a symbol, the final word in a nation's endless arguments about law, liberty, and who gets to speak. Within these walls, silence usually reigns. Deference is expected. Power speaks downward, and most simply listen. Justice Amy Coney Barrett embodied that tradition. To her supporters, she was the picture of composure, a scholar, a mother, a woman whose very presence on the bench was proof of discipline and resolve. Her voice was measured, never hurried, never rattled. She didn't need to shout. Authority radiated from the robe draped over her shoulders, from the centuries of history backing her chair. She was the gatekeeper of order, the symbol of stability. But then there was Jasmine Crockett. She did not come wrapped in centuries of marble and ritual. She carried fire, not robes. She represented the restless pulse of those who had been told to wait their turn, to lower their voices, to bow before the institution without ever questioning it. Where Barrett's authority came from tradition, Crockett's power came from defiance. She was not supposed to belong in this chamber, and yet she was here, standing eye to eye with the very embodiment of establishment power, daring to answer back. That's why this clash mattered. It wasn't simply about words exchanged in a courtroom. It was about the collision of two Americas, the one that guards the gates of tradition, and the one that fights to break them open. It was about a nation asking itself, does respect mean silence, or does it mean honesty? Millions watching from afar, didn't just see two women debating. They saw themselves reflected in the clash. Immigrant families saw their children in Crockett's refusal to bow. Young progressives saw proof that truth could still rattle the pillars of power. Even those who disagreed with her felt the unease because the moment forced a question too big to ignore. Could the hallowed silence of the Supreme Court withstand the voice of those it had long overlooked? Or was the silence finally cracking? The gavel had tried to command order, but order was not what the country felt. The country felt disruption, electricity, possibility. If someone like Crockett could raise her voice in that chamber and not be swallowed by it, then the myth of untouchable authority was already broken. This was not arrogance. It was a reminder. Democracy is not about quiet obedience. Democracy is about tension, about challenge, about the uncomfortable truth that power must always answer to the people, no matter how high the bench. And in that moment, Barrett and Crockett became stand-ins for something far larger than themselves. One represented the marble silence of tradition. The other represented the rising voices of a restless nation, and between them, the clash promised not just drama for the day, but echoes for years to come. To understand why Jasmine Crockett's words landed like thunder, you must first understand the figure they were aimed at. Justice Amy Coney Barrett did not arrive at the Supreme Court by chance. Her path was carved through years of discipline, quiet strategy, and the machinery of power that elevates some voices while silencing others. Barrett's story began far from the marble chambers of Washington. Raised in the South, she pursued her studies with relentless focus, rising through academia with the poise of someone who seemed destined for higher ground. At Notre Dame Law School, she earned admiration not only for her brilliance but for her composure. Professors and peers described her as sharp, diligent, unshakable. Even then, she carried herself with the calmness of authority. A woman who could cut through arguments without ever raising her tone. That composure became her trademark. As she ascended in her career, clerking for Justice Antonin Scalia and later teaching law, Barrett was often portrayed as a protege of conservative legal thought. She believed in textualism, the idea that the Constitution must be interpreted as written, without bending to shifting winds of politics. To her supporters, this was integrity, a principled anchor in turbulent times. To her critics, it was rigidity, a refusal to see that law is lived as much as it is written. Her nomination to the Supreme Court in 2020 became one of the most explosive moments in modern political history. America was in the grip of a pandemic. A presidential election loomed, and the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg had created a vacancy that tore the nation into two. Barrett was thrust into the spotlight as the chosen replacement, hailed by conservatives as a worthy successor and condemned by progressives as an illegitimate rush to cement power. The hearings were a spectacle of contradictions. She sat before the Senate Judiciary Committee with her calm smile and measured answers, refusing to be rattled by the most pointed questions. Supporters saw grace under fire. Detractors saw evasion. Her refusal to commit on key issues: abortion, healthcare, voting rights was described by admirers as judicial restraint, but by critics as calculated silence. When asked to display her notes during questioning, she held up a blank notepad. It became a symbol. To some, brilliance. To others, arrogance. And yet, through it all, Barrett remained untouchable. She was confirmed swiftly, sworn in with the weight of history behind her, and seated as the youngest woman ever to serve on the Supreme Court. For those who believed the court belonged to tradition, She was the perfect heir, polished, disciplined, cloaked in the solemnity of the robe. For those who saw the court as a barrier to progress, she represented something else entirely, an institution closing ranks to protect its power. This is where the contradictions of Barrett's aura come into sharp focus. To millions, she is a role model, a working mother who climbed to the highest bench in the land without scandal or noise. To millions of others, she is the face of a system that rewards silence and punishes dissent. A reminder that authority often comes packaged as calm, even when that calm masks decisions that will ripple through generations. In the courtroom, Barrett's very presence carries weight. She doesn't need to thunder her opinions. She lets the institution speak for her. The robe, the bench, the centuries of precedent, these are her allies. She embodies the power of tradition, the strength of establishment authority. And in a country where institutions are both revered and mistrusted, she sits at the fault line, commanding respect even from those who question her legitimacy. This is why the clash with Jasmine Crockett resonated so deeply. Barrett was not simply a judge hearing an argument. She was the embodiment of an entire order. An order built on the expectation that voices like Crockett's would defer, bow, and eventually fade. To challenge Barrett was to challenge the marble itself, to question the very script of American authority. And so when Crockett spoke, she was not just speaking to Barrett, the person. She was speaking to Barrett, the symbol, the untouchable, the calm, the guardian of establishment power. That is why gasps filled the chamber. That is why pens snapped, cameras clicked, and whispers turned to awe. Because here was someone daring to puncture a silence so carefully guarded by tradition. Barrett did not flinch easily, but even her silence that day carried more weight than words. It revealed the cracks in the image of untouchability. For all her composure, she could not erase the sting of Crockett's defiance. If Amy Coney Barrett embodied the calm permanence of marble tradition, Jasmine Crockett embodied the restless fire of the street. Her story did not begin in vaulted chambers or Ivy League classrooms. It began in neighborhoods where opportunity was a promise, not a guarantee. Born into a working-class family, Crockett knew early what it meant to push twice as hard for half the recognition. She wasn't raised to assume the system would bend in her favor. She was raised to fight for every inch. Her childhood was marked not by privilege, but by persistence. Teachers described her as outspoken, never content to let an unfair rule or a careless insult pass unchallenged. While other children learned to keep their heads down, Jasmine learned to raise hers higher. In classrooms, she asked the questions that made adults uncomfortable. On playgrounds, she defended the kids others mocked. That instinct to protect, to challenge, to refuse silence wasn't strategy. It was survival. As she grew, Crockett's fire only sharpened. College was not a polished path handed to her. It was a climb. She worked long hours to afford books, juggled obligations her peers didn't see, and carried the weight of knowing that if she slipped, the safety nets others relied on were not there for her. It was in these crucibles that her voice took shape, not as rhetoric, but as necessity. When she pursued law, some questioned whether she belonged in that arena. She answered those doubts the only way she knew how, by outworking and everyone around her. In courtrooms where she represented clients who had been silenced, dismissed, or ignored, Crockett became known for her refusal to sugarcoat injustice. She called it as she saw it, even if her tone rattled judges or unsettled colleagues. That boldness earned her critics, but it also earned her respect from the people who needed her most, the overlooked, the voiceless, the ones who had learned to expect nothing from the system. Her reputation grew, a fighter, a defender, a woman unafraid of confrontation. But more than that, she became a mirror for people whose struggles rarely made headlines. Every case she took, every argument she made, carried the echo of a larger fight for dignity, for recognition, for the right to stand unbowed in the face of power. It was that energy that carried her into politics. She didn't run because the halls of Congress looked welcoming. She ran because she believed those halls needed to hear voices like hers, loud, unpolished, unwilling to conform. Her critics sneered, labeling her combative, too raw, too brash for Washington. But her supporters knew the truth. She was exactly what they had been waiting for. A voice that didn't apologize for existing. A representative who spoke with the cadence of lived experience, not polished talking points. Crockett's rise was never smooth. The same boldness that made her magnetic also made her a target. Opponents tried to paint her as reckless, disruptive, dangerous. But for every headline that questioned her, there were thousands of people who finally felt seen. She wasn't speaking for the establishment, she was speaking for them, and that is what made her clash with Justice Barrett so electric. Crockett did not carry centuries of marble behind her. She carried the weight of working-class mothers, immigrant families, activists who had marched in the rain and shouted until their throats went raw. She carried the weight of those who had been told to wait their turn and knew their turn might never come. She wasn't intimidated by robes, gavels, or centuries of silence. She had already faced worse: the silence of poverty, the silence of being dismissed, the silence of being told she did not belong. For her, the courtroom was just another room where truth needed to be spoken. Her boldness wasn't for spectacle. It was for survival for herself, and for the millions who felt suffocated by a system that pretended not to hear them. When Jasmine Crockett raised her voice, she raised theirs too, and that is why the courtroom moment mattered, because for one electrifying instant the entire country saw a woman who refused to bow, and in her defiance they saw themselves. Her life had prepared her for this collision. Every playground argument, every late-night study session, every courtroom defense, every political battle had been leading here. She didn't come to the Supreme Court chamber to perform. She came prepared to speak truth, no matter the cost. The chamber was already heavy with tension when Justice Barrett leaned forward, her voice calm but edged like steel. She did not raise her tone. She didn't need to. Each syllable carried the authority of centuries, sharpened by the expectation that no one would dare to interrupt. "Counsel," she said evenly, "this courtroom demands order, not theater." The words hung in the air like a verdict. To most, that would have been enough for a quiet rebuke from the bench that signaled the line had been crossed. In the past, voices had lowered, challengers had retreated, silence had swallowed dissent. But Jasmine Crockett was not most people. She straightened, her eyes locked on Barrett, her shoulders square. "With all due respect," she began, the phrase ringing less like concession and more like defiance. "Order isn't silence, and truth is not theater." Gasps spread through the gallery, the kind of sound that erupts when witnesses realize they're watching something historic unfold. Cameras clicked furiously, desperate to capture every flicker of Barrett's expression. The justice's gaze narrowed, her jaw tightening, but her composure remained intact. She responded coolly, as though her very restraint were a reminder of who held the higher ground. "Ms. Crockett, this is not a platform for political statements. That might have ended it. It should have ended it." But Crockett leaned in, her voice gathering power, not volume. Then why is it treated like one when it benefits the powerful? Why is respect demanded here, but not shown to the people who must live with the consequences of these decisions? The murmurs grew louder. Reporters shifted in their seats, scribbling faster, glancing up to see if Barrett would strike back. The justice inhaled slowly, her tone clipped, precise. This chamber is guided by law, not passion. If we lose that, we lose everything. Crockett's reply came like a spark to dry kindling. No, if we lose the voices of the people, we lose everything. The audience jolted, as if pulled by an invisible current. Some nodded furiously, others frowned in disapproval, but no one could look away. Barrett's restraint and Crockett's fire were colliding in real time, a duel of composure versus conviction. The contrast was cinematic, the robed justice leaning on centuries of tradition, the fiery outsider fueled by generations of silence finally breaking. Every exchange tightened the coil of suspense. Barrett's words carried the weight of order. Crockett's replies carried the weight of defiance. And in between, the crowd became characters themselves, whispering, reacting, living the tension second by second. Viewers at home would later describe it as the moment they wished they could have stood up and spoken. The moment Crockett became their voice inside the chamber, where they had never been allowed to stand. The duel escalated with each line. Barrett pressed, warning that passion without discipline was chaos. Crockett countered, warning that discipline without truth was oppression. Barrett insisted on the sanctity of the institution. Crockett demanded the sanctity of the people. Neither flinched, neither backed down. It was marble against fire, order against urgency, tradition against change. And then, just as it seemed the chamber itself might split under the tension, voice cut through with a final reply, one so sharp, so unexpected, that even the marble pillars seemed to tremble. Asterisk, for what felt like an eternity, the courtroom was suspended in silence. Jasmine Crockett stood firm, her breathing steady but her eyes burning. She had matched Justice Barrett's authority blow for blow. But now the air felt different charged, like the seconds before a storm unleashes itself. Everyone in the chamber leaned in, waiting. Even Barrett, her features frozen in judicial composure, seemed to sense that something was coming. And then Crockett spoke. Her words didn't tumble out in a rush. They landed one by one, heavy, deliberate, like stones dropped into still water. Justice Barrett, she said, her voice low but carrying to every corner of the chamber, respect isn't earned by silence. Respect is earned by truth. And if truth makes this room uncomfortable, maybe it isn't the truth that needs to change. The pause that followed was deafening. For a moment, it seemed like no one could breathe. The weight of the lines sank in slowly, like a tide sweeping across the room. Reporters stopped mid-scribble, their pens hovering in the air. Jurors shifted in their seats, unsure if they'd just witnessed an act of courage or of heresy. Gavel in Barrett's hand twitched but did not fall, and then the murmurs began. First a few gasps, then whispers, then a rising hum of astonishment. The chamber was alive with its shock, admiration, outrage. The clash had already been explosive, but this was different. This was Crockett taking the unthinkable step, speaking to power not as a supplicant, not even as an opponent, but as an equal. Barrett's mask of composure cracked ever so slightly. Her eyes narrowed, her lips tightened, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something almost human irritation, maybe even doubt. She tapped her gavel once, a sharp crack that echoed like thunder, but the sound no longer commanded the room. Instead, it underscored just how much control she was struggling to keep. Crockett's words reverberated beyond the four walls instantly. The courtroom was filled with press, and the feed was live. Within minutes, clips of the moment appeared across social media. Twitter lit up like a wildfire. Did you just hear what she said to Barrett? This is history in the making. Respect isn't earned by silence. Respect is earned by truth. Quote of the year. I've never seen anyone stand up to a justice like that. Crockett is fearless. On TikTok, the clip was remixed with flashing captions and reaction videos, users mouthing Crockett's words in solidarity. On Instagram, it was clipped into reels, slow-motioned at the exact moment she delivered her line. Even late-night hosts would replay it, framing it as the defining mic drop of a generation. Inside the chamber, the moment only grew more electric. The crowd, citizens, observers, students of law, was visibly divided. Some clapped their hands to their mouths in disbelief. Others sat straighter, almost proud, as though they too had just spoken truth to power. For those long excluded from spaces like this, it felt like someone had finally cracked the marble shell of the institution. Barrett, ever the embodiment of establishment authority, tried to recover. This courtroom, she said sharply, is not a forum for, but the words faltered, drowned out by the whispers and shifting energy in the room. Her authority was still there, but it no longer felt absolute. Crockett had broken the spell, and Crockett knew it. She didn't gloat, didn't grin, didn't even move. She simply let her words hang in the air, their resonance growing stronger with each passing second. That restraint letting silence underline the point was the masterstroke. It was less about defiance now and more about inevitability. The catharsis of the moment rippled far beyond law and politics. For many watching, Crockett's reply was more than a courtroom sparring match. It was rebellion against silence itself, against the unwritten rule that those without robes or titles must bow, lower their eyes, and accept the authority of those perched above. For every person who had swallowed words in a boardroom, in a classroom, in the halls of power, this was their vindication. On CNN, anchors called it the line that will be studied in political science classes for years. On Fox, commentators blasted it as a reckless display of grandstanding. The split was predictable, but the fact remained. Crockett had seized the nation's attention, and there was no giving it back. Meanwhile, the emotional layering continued to build in real time. Crockett's supporters saw her as brave, audacious, necessary. Critics called her disrespectful, even dangerous. But regardless of where anyone stood, no one could deny that the line had landed like a seismic shock. The courtroom, an institution built on hierarchy, had just been turned upside down by 9 words spoken with unshakable conviction, and in that transformation, something shifted in the collective psyche. Respect had been redefined, not as obedience to authority, but as accountability to truth. The echoes of that redefinition reached the young, the marginalized, the unheard. Crockett had given them a language, a mantra, a rallying cry. Even Barrett, for all her gravitas, seemed to sense it. She pressed her lips together, leaned back slightly, and said nothing. And in that silence, the balance of power had already changed. The courtroom would, of course, return to order. The gavel would fall again, the proceedings would continue, and Barrett would resume her mantle of authority. But the moment could not be undone. It had been etched into history, a mic-drop counterattack that could not be unspoken as reporters filed out. Phones buzzed, and news alerts flashed across screens nationwide. One thing was clear. Jasmine Crockett's words had not only stunned a courtroom, they had cracked open the narrative of who gets to speak and who must listen. The gavel had fallen. The courtroom doors had closed, but the echo of Jasmine Crockett's words refused to fade. Within minutes, the clash between her and Justice Barrett became more than a legal exchange, it became a cultural earthquake. Screens lit up across the nation. Hashtags trended before the stenographers had even finished transcribing the hearing, and Crockett's name was suddenly on everyone's lips. On Twitter, the moment exploded with the force of a lightning strike. Hashtag Respect His Truth began trending worldwide. Clips of Crockett's line delivered in slow motion, set against dramatic music, circulated endlessly. Memes appeared within hours. Barrett depicted as a crumbling marble statue, Crockett as a woman with fire in her voice and steel in her gaze. The internet turned her words into art, remixing them into graphics, animations, and slogans. Late-night comedians seized on it instantly. One joked Barrett thought she was presiding over the Supreme Court, but Crockett reminded her this was the People's Court. Another quipped when Jasmine Crockett spoke. You could practically hear every grandma, every student loan borrower, every activist yelling Amen. At the TV, laughter filled studios, but beneath the humor was an acknowledgement. Something bigger had happened. Celebrities chimed in too. A-list actors, pop stars, and athletes tweeted their support. A Grammy-winning singer called it the line of the decade. A beloved activist and director posted a black-and-white photo of Crockett with the caption, "Respect isn't earned by silence." Frame this on every wall in America. Her words were no longer just courtroom dialogue, they had become cultural scripture. Yet not everyone celebrated. Conservative pundits flooded the airwaves, decrying the exchange as a dangerous undermining of respect for the court. Editorials accused Crockett of staging a TikTok moment instead of honoring constitutional decorum. On talk radio, callers vented about chaos in the chamber and warned that if lawmakers could talk back to justices this way, the whole system could unravel. For every admirer, there was a detractor, and the clash deepened America's fault lines. But for ordinary people, the kind who rarely feel seen inside marble halls of justice, the moment was transformative. In diners, on factory floors, in classrooms, people replayed Crockett's words like a hymn. She said what we all wanted to say, a grocery clerk told a local reporter. She wasn't afraid, and for once, I felt like maybe someone up there was speaking for me. Young activists felt emboldened. College students printed her words on posters, carried them at rallies, turned them into chants. High schoolers clipped the video and shared it across Snapchat, writing captions like, "This is why I want to study law." Communities that had long carried the burden of silence, immigrants, women of color, working-class families, saw themselves reflected in Crockett's defiance. It wasn't just about one fiery moment. It was about validation. It was the feeling of finally watching someone step into the arena and refuse to shrink. The emotional aftershocks ran deep. For many, Crockett's line didn't just challenge Barrett, it challenged an entire culture of deference to power. It cracked the myth that authority must always go unchallenged, that robes and gavels demand obedience without accountability. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't just about what Crockett said, but about what America allows itself to hear. On podcasts, progressive voices framed it as a turning point. This wasn't disrespect, one host argued. This was democracy, alive and breathing. On TikTok, creators stitched Crockett's clip with their own personal stories of being silenced at work. ignored in class, dismissed in public, ended each video with her words, spoken like a pledge. The courtroom exchange had become a mirror for the nation's daily struggles with respect and truth. For critics, it was chaos. For supporters, it was courage. But for millions of Americans, it was something even more personal. Liberation, asterisk, in the end. What lingered was not the marble solemnity of the courtroom, nor the sharp cadence of Justice Barrett's retorts. What lingered were the words of Jasmine Crockett, words that cut through centuries of ritual, words that reminded America that truth is not reserved for the powerful. The clash had been framed, on its surface, as authority against rebellion, a justice cloaked in the traditions of the court versus a congresswoman armed only with her voice. But at its core, it was something deeper. It was the timeless conflict between dignity and arrogance, between silence demanded and truth spoken, between power that expects obedience and courage that refuses to yield. For Barrett, authority was embodied in composure, in order, in the notion that institutions survive because challengers are kept at bay. For Crockett, authority meant something different. The courage to disrupt when silence became complicity. The audacity to speak when decorum masked injustice. That is why the moment resonated far beyond legal arguments. People didn't replay Crockett's line because it was clever, they replayed it because it was clarifying. It gave shape to a feeling millions carried, but rarely saw articulated. The belief that respect is not demanded by position, but earned through truth. This was not about disrespecting the court. It was about reclaiming the dignity of the people. It wasn't about one fiery exchange. It was about refusing to be silenced in the very halls where silence has too often been mistaken for respect. And that is why the clash mattered. Because in that moment, Crockett reminded America of something profound, that democracy only breathes when ordinary voices dare to rise. Even against extraordinary power, the lesson was clear. Justice without courage is fragile. Power without accountability is hollow. But truth spoken with conviction, whether by a congresswoman in a courtroom or by an ordinary citizen in their daily life, can ripple outward in ways that no gavel can contain. It is easy to believe that the system belongs to the few who sit in high seats. But Crockett showed that dignity belongs to all who refuse to be diminished. Her words carried not just her own defiance, but the echoes of countless Americans who have long waited to be heard. This is why her moment became more than politics. It became inspiration. It became proof that one voice, unafraid and unshaken, can pierce the armor of centuries. It became a reminder that Americanness is not about silence in the face of authority, but about courage in the service of justice. And so the moral stands. It wasn't about one reply. It was about the refusal to bow, the refusal to let power go unchallenged, the refusal to let silence win. It was about the truth that dignity belongs not to marble walls, but to the people, whose stories they enclose. Asterisk, and so we return to that stunning courtroom moment, the instant when Jasmine Crockett looked authority in the eye and refused to shrink. It wasn't just a reply. It was a spark, a declaration that truth cannot be silenced, not even beneath the shadow of the Supreme Court. Justice Barrett may have worn the robe, but on that day, it was Crockett's words that carried the weight of justice. This story isn't about one clash, one gavel, or one chamber. It's about what happens when courage refuses to bow. It's about the possibility that in a country divided, one voice of defiance can still unite millions in hope, dignity, and pride. Crockett's reply stunned the courtroom, but its echo belongs to all of us. Now the question becomes, what do we do with it? Do we let it fade into headlines and hashtags? Or do we carry it forward as a reminder that every time truth is spoken to power, democracy grows stronger? If you believe in speaking truth to power, if you believe in lifting voices that the system too often tries to mute, then this is your place. Join this channel, share this story, add your voice to the movement. Because when we amplify moments like this, we're not just telling stories, we're building a future where courage is louder than silence. Jasmine Crockett showed us what one fiery voice can do inside a courtroom. Together, we can make sure that echo is never forgotten. Subscribe now, share widely, and let's keep the fire alive.